The crash of a U.S. plane in Mexico, Western Airlines Flight 2605, left one of its survivors charging that authorities covered up the truth. The date, October 31st, 1979. The flight, known as the Night Owl, was on its way from Los Angeles to Mexico City, on its way to a crisis. 90 passengers were on board. Everything seemed normal until the aircraft started its descent into Mexico City. Dense fog shrouded the airport, and there was another problem. The standard runway for international landings, 23 left, had just been closed with heavy equipment on the runway. All flights were being rerouted to a parallel runway, number 23 right. Captain Charles Gilbert was flying the aircraft, a route he'd flown 350 times before. But just before touchdown, Captain Gilbert was clearly confused about what runway to land on. Listen to the cockpit recorder. The crew tried to abort the landing, but it was too late. In the dense morning fog, the aircraft had touched down on the runway that was closed, hit a truck, and spun into a building.
I could see a flash. The noise was just tremendous. And then the jet fuel, you could feel the jet fuel just coming everywhere, through my nose, into my lungs. And I looked down at the floor, and I could see the floor splitting open. And the cracks continued up the wall, and this fireball formed in a split second and shot right through the cabin. And I turned into the cabin. I could see bodies flying back like missiles shooting through. I thought I was dead.
Ed survived, but 62 passengers and 11 crew members did not.
I remember I came upon a section, and slowly the fire started to engulf those people and the little boy. And that little boy was looking me right in the eyes and screaming and screaming. And the fire truck wouldn't put out any water. And I had to stand there and watch them, with my eyes mostly on that little boy, burn to death.
Even before the wreckage had cooled down, just hours after the crash, newspapers, both in the United States and Mexico, blamed Captain Charles Gilbert. The reason? Pilot error for landing on the wrong runway. Both American and Mexican investigators accepted that verdict without any doubt. Pilot error. But Ed Valenciana had his doubts. So what are the memories when you stop and see the area where this happened?
There's a lot of love towards the crew that I miss, and anger about the lies that kept this thing covered up.
The first sign of a cover-up in Ed's mind? As one of the few survivors of the crash, he was questioned by Mexican authorities. To his surprise, their key issue was whether he had served alcohol to the cockpit crew.
I realized that the papers they were shoving in front of me had statements concerning that I had served cocktail beverages to the pilots. And a boy ran in with a paper that instantly said, pilot error. So I knew from their conversation what they were trying to get from me.
Which was?
Which was to admit that I had served alcoholic beverages to the pilots during the flight.
Had you?
Not at all.
Captain Charles Gilbert, who was killed in the crash, was considered an outstanding pilot during his 30 years with Western Airlines. Gilbert also was considered one of Western's safest pilots, and even taught methods to escape crash landings to other captains. So some colleagues were not convinced that Captain Gilbert had been the sole cause of the crash. Why had such an experienced pilot made such a critical error? That question's never really been answered. In fact, there's growing evidence that pilot error was not the key reason for the crash. Officials here in Mexico City appear to have prevented a thorough investigation of what went wrong. Ralph Baxter, an airlines pilot himself, went to Mexico City for the American Pilots Union and started asking the same questions that had bothered Ed Valenciana and the family of Captain Gilbert. His view of the official Mexican report?
More or less a whitewash of many factors that contributed to the accident.
Point 1, the Airline Pilots Association probe found that American investigators were kept from the crash site, and the wreckage itself was not roped off, so the Mexican report was incomplete. Point 2, the Mexico City airport already had a bad reputation, particularly because many American pilots considered the radar and air traffic control systems inadequate. Point 3, the American investigators were not allowed to question the air traffic controllers who handle the aircraft, and there were serious questions about conflicting instructions to the cockpit throughout the flight. The final point in the independent report, and perhaps the most damaging of all, air controller error. Remember that dense fog covered the airport, so air controllers guided the flight to 23 left, because it's the only one equipped with a radio beacon to locate the runways. Just before the aircraft touched down, the controllers corrected their mistake, but it was too late. Only 8 seconds before the landing, Captain Gilbert finally realized he had been given the wrong approach. Listen again to the flight recorder.
We're cleared on the right. We're cleared on the right. Is that right? No, this is approach to the goddamn left.
The transcript of conversations between the cockpit crew and Mexican air controllers shows that the aircraft was guided onto the closed runway, 23 left. That was eliminated from the final Mexican report in an apparent effort to hide this key fact. The top Mexican crash investigator dismissed the findings of the American Pilots Union.
Que la responsabilidad de la investigación es responsabilidad.
The responsibility of any investigation is the responsibility of the Mexican government. And this means that it does not permit any criticism from any organization, and especially a foreign one.
For the family of Captain Gilbert, there is some solace that he was not the real culprit, but they're still bitter.
It's a shame. It's a real shame that something like this can happen. And that Mexico City can get away, the Mexican government can get away with something like this.
The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board says it can't reopen the case of Flight 2605, letting the report of Mexican authorities stand, placing the blame with veteran pilot Charles Gilbert for not aborting the landing. But more than 10 years after that crash, Ed Valenciana, who had become a teacher in the Los Angeles school system, refused to give up.
There's a fault in this system. The governments won't do anything about it. The airline industry won't do anything about it. Their goal is to make money. And it's time that the U.S. public, the paying passenger, speak up, say something so that Washington will listen and these incidences won't ever happen again.
The NTSB did urge new charts to help pilots faced with the type of difficult landing maneuver called a sidestep that Captain Gilbert faced in Mexico City. When we come back, what lessons did we learn from these tragedies, and how can we use them? There are so many factors that go into the making of a plane crash: weather, mechanical failure, human error, the unpredictable actions of a madman or a fanatic. There's no way to predict them all. After Pan Am 103, several airlines have made public threats against specific flights from specific cities, letting passengers decide whether or not they will accept the risk. A new security device was being tested by the Federal Aviation Administration to detect the kind of bomb used to destroy Pan Am 103. It uses high technology to sniff out bombs hidden inside luggage. The deadly combination of fog and human error did not end in Mexico City. In Detroit in December of 1990, one jet mistakenly taxied onto an active runway in heavy fog and collided with another plane already on its takeoff roll. The resulting crash and fire claimed 8 lives. Science and technology can provide some of the answers, but as we've seen, it's often impossible to determine the precise cause of a disaster, and harder still to ensure that they never happen again.